Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for your time. As I mentioned in that opening, in recent years, South Africa has experienced severe crises, and we are going through some of those challenges right now. And in some cases, like last year, the erosion of state has proceeded so far as to leading to widespread social as well as political unrest. Is this reason enough to start speaking of state failure and state collapse? Claude, I know you've recently released a report which has been widely debated on this particular point, where you, I suppose, look at a number of data points that cover the whole spectrum of government's performance, from security, crime fighting, justice system, political governance, economic performance, infrastructure, and so on, as well as distribution of welfare, which is particularly important. Now, there are two areas some of the academics and writers on this point to that would, in a sense, forecast a state failure. One is the failure to secure the territory, within the territory. Two is the absence of rule of law, but also the collapse in delivering positive political goods to the inhabitants of the country. When you look at all that and look at where we are right now, would you say is it really necessary to have this conversation?
Oh, absolutely. It is absolutely vital to have this conversation. And I wouldn't say that South Africa is a failed state. I say that South Africa is a failing state. And we have to look at things from two angles. One is historical, and the other one is comparative. So how are we doing relative to other countries, and how are we doing relative to where we were, where we have been, and we'll see where we are going. And both, if you want, axes of perspective confirm that South Africa has been experiencing relative to where it bested itself, and we can take the years 2005, 2006, 2007 as the peak. And since then, it has been bottoming out non-stop, as well as comparing itself to peers like the BRICS, for instance, countries in Africa, other emerging markets. South Africa has shown obvious signs of failure in all the key attributes of state performance. Now, a lot of people will disagree about what that means, state performance. At Eunomix, what we try to do is come up with the least controversial, most comparative, most data-based perspective. And there we see not just, if you want, signs of impending state failure, but we see acceleration in that particular direction. And that's just looking at things from a number of fairly high-level data points. And then when you start digging in, which is what we do in the business, then you see potential signs of crisis coming over the next 2 to 3 years that might take us from a potential ranking as a failed state, around 2028, 2030, to something that might come much earlier. And is giving us great concern, and which I'm sure we'll discuss about it.
Mr. Clem, let's bring you in here. It's a highly contentious issue and certainly hotly debated. People are saying, if you, for example, look at the four characteristics of a failed state: loss of control of its territory, or the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. If you look at the erosion of legitimate authority to make collective decisions, if you look at the inability to provide public services, inability to interact with other states, they'll tell you South Africa doesn't tick any of these boxes, and therefore we cannot even begin to speak of a failed state. What are the central aspects, in your view, to this concept of state failure?
Sorry, I thought you were asking Claude.
No, Clem, that's for you. Sorry, your names are so close together. It's very difficult. Clem, that's for you.
But, I wanted to mention one critical aspect in terms of the recovery of the economy, which is not, we all know about the law and order side, and the fact that we've got to have social harmony. But for me, the most critical thing to address is the quality of our infrastructure. I remember doing a scenario session at the Central Party School in Beijing, which was the leadership academy for the Chinese Communist Party. And one of the professors said we went from being the 100th ranked economy in 1978 to number 5 today, because I did it in 2006, and of course they're number 2 now, and may well overtake America to become the biggest economy by 2030. And he said Deng Xiaoping put emphasis on 2 things. He said, for government, it's all about infrastructure and providing good ports, good roads, good telecommunication systems, power stations, all those kind of things. He said that's something that we've got to do. But the other thing is we've got to allow ordinary Chinese people to create wealth for themselves. He said those are the 2 critical aspects to having a successful economy. Yeah. So for me right now, the real emphasis is on how do we actually improve the quality of our infrastructure. And I was so glad that Cyril, in his State of the Nation address, said that, he wanted to go into partnership with the private sector in improving electricity and improving all the other things we know are bad news in South Africa. But as far as the second aspect is concerned, we're going to have to construct a new economy which is much more inclusive and which puts a huge emphasis on entrepreneurs and how they can be helped, because that is the way we're going to, get back to an economic growth rate of 5 to 10%, and no talk of a failed state will happen if we do those 2 things.
Yeah. Claude, you speak on that question of the economy that Clem is now raising, that we as South Africa, at least in the last, 25 years, have failed to transform this economy. And that's partly the reason why we are speaking of 20% of the population being employed and being the one paying for, I suppose, the rest of the population in South Africa, and saying this is not something that is sustainable. And because we have failed, and if we proceed on that trajectory, this will lead certainly to this scenario of state failure. Just expand a little bit on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I can't disagree fundamentally with what Clem said about infrastructure and an inclusive economy. But we can't really parallel with China, because China is a centralized state with a party that has been in control for, 70 years and has the repressive means to maintain control of a territory and to maintain absolute order. Hong Kong reminds us of that, and obviously Tiananmen in 1989. Which, these are the things you've raised. I mean, what I really like about the conversation we're having is that we're having a principled conversation about what is a failed state and how do we measure it, rather than having an emotional conversation about it, although it's a very difficult conversation to have. So we must not take for granted the fact that, we have a state that is capable of maintaining law and order, because we've seen that that's not the case. We have an extremely fragile bureaucracy. We have an extremely vulnerable public infrastructure and superstructure. And that means that whatever policy decisions are made, whatever investment decisions are made, are either not implementable or not implemented. And we need to talk about that, because that is the key to doing what Clem says needs to be done. We do need massive infrastructure investment on basic things, right? We do need to have an inclusive economy. But we have an economic policy ideology, and we have the infrastructure and the superstructure of a state which are resolutely anti-growth and resolutely anti-mass employment for all sorts of reasons. Now, what does an inclusive economy look like in a country where indeed only 20% of the population is employed, and that is decreasing, where we have continuous population growth, and at this point in time, for the past 3-4 years, population growth is greater than economic growth, which means that everybody is getting poorer, and now getting poorer faster because of the pandemic. There cannot be a state that is successful and sustainable without a sustainable way of creating and distributing wealth one way or another. And broadly speaking, what Eunomix work has shown over and over is that you have very few recipes for economic success and a lot of recipes for economic failures. States which succeed tend to be the ones who have one of three things generally. And they tend not to have those three things together. But from an economic standpoint, they have a lot of oil. And we can think of the Middle Eastern countries. They have a lot of oil, so much oil that the state, provided it has a bit of developmental agenda, as we see in many Middle Eastern countries, so much oil that can be reinvested in social services, social performance, employment protection, and effectively that state develops on the back of oil. And then hopefully it diversifies. Some countries in the Middle East have been successful in it. Obviously, the UAEs. Some haven't, like Kuwait, right? And some are trying, like Saudi Arabia. So you have to have oil, right? A lot of it. Or you have to have a lot of people. And then you have to have two types of a lot of people. You have to have a lot of people with very high levels of skills and productivity, which is what you find in advanced economies. Or you have to have a lot of people who are employed in, well, factories. And this is usually the path of development that countries that do not have natural resources follow, like Hong Kong did, like Singapore did, like Taiwan did, like Germany did in the 19th century, and Britain in the 18th century, and the likes, and so forth. And countries like Bangladesh are emulating now quite successfully, before it was, considered to be just a country that was engaged in the race to the bottom. Oh. The problem is South Africa is that right now, the country is neither. It doesn't have oil resources, the like of which would develop the economy without employing, the vast majority of the citizen. The second problem is that it doesn't have an enormous middle class that can effectively create highly productive services and industries for its own market and for overseas market. And the third one, obviously, is that we have a policy which proactively destroys employment in the working class. We see the deindustrialization, and makes employment very difficult in the middle class because of regulations, which explains this gross collapse that the country has been experiencing since now 2011, and which is a structural condition that no amount of public speaking and incantation to investment is going to turn.
All right, let's take a break, Claude. When we come back, I want you to outline a little bit more that what are then the alternatives, or what is the alternative approach? And I want Clem to also jump in on those three issues that you're raising that we are lacking in the South African economy. Come back tonight here on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, Channel 405. Thanks for staying on as we interrogate and critique the discourse on a failed state, something that certainly has been back in conversation of late. We heard from various quarters people beginning to talk about this conversation. Are we a failed state? Well, is it reason enough that we've seen some unrest in July for us to start speaking of state failure? Is it reason enough that some positive political goods are not being deposited into the lives of inhabitants? Is this reason enough to talk about a failed state? Of course, the fact that our economy has not seen growth, at least a significant one in the last 11 years. Let's talk about those issues. 072-110-5584. Give us your views tonight, or tweet us at Newzroom405. Clem Sunter, let's talk then about those three issues. How do you sustain an economy where at least a majority of the population is not in the formal economy, where we were not endowed with huge oil reserves, and where the policy at this particular point is being hotly disputed?
Yeah, look, Thabo, we do have an alternative to oil. We have mineral resources. And why did South Africa become the leading economy in Africa? It was because we discovered diamonds, and then we discovered gold. and we still have huge resources of platinum and other metals. We certainly have coal, and we definitely have got to obviously do a lot more prospecting and use those resources profitably. Yeah. So I don't think we're without oil. Obviously, in terms of the real stuff, petroleum, we are, but we do have a huge, rich diversity of natural resources, which are still there in many cases to exploit. The second thing is we have world-class companies in this country. We have world-class mining companies, retail companies. So we have actually created a modern economy in South Africa, probably the most modern economy in Africa. But the real thing, and this is where Claude is absolutely right, we haven't actually spread that economy throughout our country. And we haven't integrated township economies into the mainstream economy, rural into urban economy. We haven't done any of that. And yes, we have grand economic plans, but my basic point is that it's not going to be the big companies anymore that are going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs because of automation and artificial intelligence. And you've got to compete with the rest of the world. So you can't, stop using the most modern methods to manufacture things. So the real emphasis in terms of job creation in future has to be on how we can create a much friendlier climate for small business and entrepreneurs. Right now in America, two-thirds of the job creation post the pandemic is in small business. That's how America operates, and that's why it has an unemployment rate of 4% versus Europe, which is sort of sitting between 6 and 10%. It's because in America, particularly in the more rural states, people run small businesses. Yeah. So I want to see a specialist panel of entrepreneurs who have actually run real businesses, like Adrian Gore of Discovery, even get Elon Musk of Tesla, who's a South African, educated at Pretoria Boys High. And get these people together to be a council, just like we have a council of medical experts to advise the president for our latest COVID strategies. We need, in terms of creating that second point that Claude talks about, we need that kind of council of real entrepreneurs, which we haven't got, to say these are the 5 critical ways that you can encourage small business to grow in South Africa and the integration of our economy. Let me just make one point. Why is America the #1 nation on earth? It's not because of the politicians. Yes, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln were great presidents and all that. It's because they had the entrepreneurs like Henry Ford, who discovered the first way of making the first cheap vehicle, Walt Disney with his cartoons, Bill Gates with his computer operating system, Steve Jobs, probably the most influential human being in modern history with his iPhone. That's what makes America the #1 nation on earth. Yeah. We've got to put a similar emphasis on creating an entrepreneurial environment in South Africa.
I'm sure Claude has got very interesting views to weigh in on that, because particularly on how to move from the third to the fourth industrialization, and certainly this question on natural resources. I know you say you agree with the EFF's diagnostic of the problem, but not necessarily with their policies. But one of the views of the EFF, of course, which is widely communicated, is the nationalization of mines, because their view is that, of course, these mines sitting in private hands are no use for the state. They can't really use them effectively. But not only that, then you've got labor, as Clem raises, world-class companies in the country saying, well, those world-class companies are taking all their profits out of the country, and they are not investing them. They're on some sort of investment strike. So it's some kind of a stalemate where we are not moving anywhere as far as that is concerned. But do weigh in on your thoughts around those issues.
All right. So firstly, yeah, we have mineral resources, and they did serve their, if you want, their growth developmental purpose. And I'm not dismissive of the sector. I mean, I have a lot of mining clients, and the reason why I have mining clients in South Africa is because they play a very important role in creating staple, economic value and jobs and exports and currency revenues and all that. But currently, mineral rents, which is kind of the top line of the mining industry, minus all the costs, jobs, and all that, is about 5-6% of GDP. The best South Africa did during the commodity booms of the 2003, 2009, 10 years was about 12% of GDP. That's a lot, but to give you an idea, a point of comparison, during the commodity boom, the oil rents in countries like Saudi and Kuwait and Qatar were around 50, 60, 70% of GDP. Okay. Which means that oil literally inundates the economy with cheap cash, right? The problem is that mining is only an economic foundation. It's not enough on its own. Now, how did the Afrikaners develop this economy in the 1950s and 60s and 70s? Well, it was in a very different world, and they kind of used the mining resources to create massive infrastructure projects and to create a new class of business entrepreneurs, etc. Well, it worked. So people are saying, well, why shouldn't we reproduce the model of the Afrikaners, which is effectively the position of the EFF and the position of the left of the ANC is, we need to repossess the land, we need to repossess the mines. It makes complete sense to nationalize an oil producing company because oil pumps itself, and to screw it up, you have to be really, really, really bad. Yeah. But mining is not the same at all. For every ton of mineral you pull out of earth, you have to reinvest almost the entirety of your profit.
Claude, we have a minute left. I'm going to be out of time. So wrap it up for me in a minute.
So what do we need is mining in it. Yeah. What's the alternative? It's the alternative that no one wants to do. It's entrepreneurship is not going to solve the problem either because we don't have a market. The problem with South Africa is that it's a very small country. It has not enough resources, but it has tremendous competitiveness in assets that are not used. Its geographic position between Asia and the US, for instance. The solution is not rocket science. It's an investment climate that attracts capital, retains our domestic capital, because indeed Clem is right, there is a private sector here. And that private sector needs to be better regulated, there must be more competition, and we need to create things like real special economic zones that create real jobs in the low end of the manufacturing world, things that the DTI doesn't want to hear with their localization strategy, which is going to fail, and is going to create more economic dislocation. We need to be humble, and we need to realize that the economy of the 1970s, 1990s was an artificial economy that depended on the back of an excluded majority. We need to create an inclusive economy, but you don't do that by spending money you don't have and creating a debt crisis. 3 years into which we are about to be. I mean, it's going to happen in about 3-4 years. We have serious problems, and all these talks about panels and plans, and we know what the solutions are. Countries that were in much worse shapes than us did it. They did it by putting the people to work. And the South Africans want to work, they are being denied the opportunity.